Welcome to Plot Twist Radio, the show where creativity, storytelling, and the unpredictable path of the creative life all collide. I'm your host, Erin Egnatz. Leslie, hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me as a guest.
It's great to have you. Can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, I'm Leslie Schover, and I had a long career as a clinical psychologist with kind of a odd specialty of helping people with cancer and other chronic illnesses with their sex lives and fertility. And now this year, at the age of 73, I've published my first novel, which is called Fission, a novel of atomic heartbreak, and is loosely based on my parents' about being in Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project.
Wow, that is quite incredible. I was wondering, what does atomic heartbreak mean in that sense?
Well, I used fission as a metaphor for heartbreak in the book. In the beginning of the book, Doris, the heroine, is being told about the atomic bomb and what fission is, and she says, "Oh, splitting it's like heartbreak, like splitting the atom's heart." And during the course of the book, she and Rob, her husband, have some troubles in their marriage, so I used that fission metaphor a couple of times.
Wow, that's a really good metaphor. I need to brush up on my science because I didn't know what it meant. I stick to the arts. Um,
Definitely.
but your background is in clinical psychology, like you said, which is a very fascinating topic. How did that shape the kind of stories you're drawn to tell?
I think it makes me focus a lot on characters and characterization. And I also did a lot of couple therapy and writing about couples. So I think I focus a lot on relationships and tension and intimacy, all those kind of things. And I wrote 4 nonfiction books in the past that were focused on 3 of them were self-help and 1 was a textbook. And whenever I would write a kind of a case example, I would always try to make it a composite. So I might use, an element from something I had heard, but I never wanted to do anything where someone could recognize themselves.
Right. Yes. I can imagine that would be a little sticky there. So the novel, as you said, is inspired by your parents' experiences at Oak Ridge. When did you first realize that their story could become a fictionalized tale?
Well, they always told these stories starting early in my childhood, and I grew up in the Cold War, so there was a lot of concern about the atomic bomb, and I asked my dad, "Why aren't we building a bomb shelter?" And he said, "Honey, it wouldn't help." But my mother unfortunately died when I was around 40, but my dad lived a lot longer than that, and as he got in his oldest years, he started giving talks to senior citizens groups about his Manhattan Project experience and stuff, and I think, I thought about videotaping him, and unfortunately, he had a catastrophic fall, and I was a little too late to get much of anything on videotape, but I always wanted to do something with their stories, and I always loved the idea of writing fiction, but I hadn't really had time to do any of fiction writing since my college undergrad days. So once I really retired and had the time, it occurred to me that this would make a great basis for a novel.
Absolutely. Do you feel like fiction allows us to understand, I guess, history in a more emotional way than nonfiction?
Definitely, and, we talk a lot about how, especially younger people today, seem to forget so much of history so fast, and I've always loved historical fiction, and I think it's a great, fun way to really learn about history, and, of course, I tried to make this book as realistic as I could. I did a lot of research, both with primary sources and reading books and stuff, and a lot of the plot has fictional elements. There's a love triangle in the book between the wife and the young couple and a possible Soviet atomic spy, and that's certainly nothing that ever happened as far as I know with my parents. But there were 2 Soviet atomic spies in Oak Ridge who operated undetected and were only really found out almost, maybe just 5 or 10 years ago, and they managed to escape back to the Soviet Union without being caught, and they both worked in the same building as my father, and like him, they were both electronics engineers, so, chances are my parents did meet them or know them, but their names were certainly not anything that was familiar from any of their stories.
Wow, that is interesting. We see this, in fictionalized tales, but to know that it actually happened, it kind of sends like a little bit of a shiver through you, that they're so close.
Yeah, and another thing that was really cool is that when I started researching the book, I knew the name of my father's group leader. He was a chemist named Charles Coriel who taught at MIT after the war. And I started looking him up online and discovered that his daughter had published a whole book of interviews with him about his Manhattan Project and later career. And so it was on Amazon, and I got it, and then I contacted her, and we're now really good friends. But there was a story in that book he mentioned my father just was very junior, and he just mentioned him briefly a couple of times, but there was a story I had never heard from my parents that on the day they announced the bombing of Hiroshima, everybody in the lab it was announced on the radio by Truman, and everybody in the lab wanted to listen, but you weren't allowed to have radios in the lab because they were worried that they could be listening devices for spies. So my dad, who was a big radio buff, had his radio from home at the lab because it was broken and he needed to repair it. And so first one of the other wives was calling into the secretary and telling her everything that was being said on the radio. And within a few minutes, my dad had our home radio repaired. They said, "The heck with, the rules today," and they turned it on and everybody was listening, so I'd never heard that story.
Wow. You gotta go back some. My husband, his grandfather was in World War II, and I think he was one of them that was going to drop the bomb. So I have loved to explore some of that family history, but you don't really think about it. We didn't have the TVs that we do now. Radio was the main way of getting that information. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, there were hardly any TV broadcasts at all, it was just at the very beginning. I remember still having a black and white TV as a child in one of those big old cabinets, getting a color t I don't think we got a color TV till I was in maybe middle school or high school.
Really? Yes. When you brought that up, I was just watching I Love Lucy the other day, and for whatever reason, I thought about when she took that TV apart. I don't know if you ever watched I Love Lucy, but it
I
was like
did, but
one
I
of
don't
those. It
remember.
was so funny. I actually was just watching it last night. That's what brought my attention to it. But they were the big cabinet ones, like you were saying, and it was supposed to just slide out. But Lucy being Lucy, she just took the whole thing apart, and Ricky freaked out because she ruined yet another thing. But that's getting off topic. But let's get to your writing process. You said that you've written some self help books before. What was the biggest shift when moving into fiction?
Well, I think the whole idea of, plotting and whether to be a pantser or a plotter and how much of an outline to have. And when I did a first draft, I gave it to a literary agent who's kind of a writing mentor and personal friend just to do an edit on it. And he said to me, "Leslie, are you writing a memoir or a novel?" And I said, "Well, I can't write a memoir. I wasn't there." And I'm trying to write a novel, and he said, "Well, it needs more drama, all these everyday tales are nice, but, you need something to bring it together." So that's when I started really thinking more about, the love triangle element, and I added in some tension about whether the wife was gonna follow her husband to Oak Ridge that actually didn't happen in real life, things like that. So the everyday stories were great for the background and the day-to-day life of the novel, but it needed a structure that I wasn't used to writing.
Yeah. Did you find that fiction is more freeing after you got past that hump, or do you think that it's more challenging?
Well, I think it's freeing in a way that it's more fun. I mean, I had a fair amount of fun writing my nonfiction books because they were, especially the ones that were geared for the general public, because that always felt more fun to me than writing the professional stuff, which I wrote a ton of. And this is even an order of magnitude more fun because, you can create a world. When I'm writing dialogue, if it's going well, I think a lot of writers say this, I feel like my characters are talking to me, and I'm kind of eavesdropping on their conversation, and when it's going well, it's really a great process, I really enjoy it.
Yes, I feel the same way. I was just telling someone the other day, I created these characters and I had this set in my mind of how they were going to be, but once I started writing, they just became someone completely different. And I was like, okay, I guess we're going with that. They're taking me wherever we go. So that is a very common theme I've noticed with authors of fiction. What does your writing process look like? We kind of, you just were talking about the pantser or whatever. I'm a pantser. I wish I was a plotter, but I'm not. How about you?
Well, at this point, because 'cause I've written 2 other novels too, I try to have at least a broad outline, but I don't always know everything that's gonna happen in between the most major events, and so I think I'm halfway between a plotter and a pantser, and I also tend to I'll write a chapter and then, the next day maybe or a day or 2 later, I'll go back and I'll go through that chapter and rewrite it and then go forward. So I'm kind of when I say how many drafts I do, it's not as discrete as, well, I did 1 draft and then I did the 2nd draft. I'm always kind of redrafting as I go.
Yeah, yeah, I'm the same way. So, as far as the book goes, like you said, it's during the Manhattan Project, but do you see parallels to today's world? It doesn't have to be politically, it could be scientifically or even emotionally.
Oh, I think there are a lot of parallels. I mean, it was a real ethical dilemma for the people that were involved, and I talked to my father about this a bit. I sat with him the day that public television finally broadcast a declassified film of all the injuries to people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was really, really awful to watch, and I turned to him and I said, "Dad, how do you feel about having worked on this?" And he said, "Well, you have to realize that we all thought the Nazis were on the track to get the bomb, and our first job was to get it first." So I think that a lot of the dilemma of how the bomb should be used really came about once it was tested at Los Alamos and they knew it was going to work. And then the only party left in the war was Japan. And that was the issue of whether to drop it on Japan. And my dad was one of about 67 people in Oak Ridge who signed a petition to Truman not to use the bomb on Japan without a demonstration first, hoping that then Japan would surrender. The people that, were in charge of inventing the bomb were really hell bent on using it, and that I don't think the petition ever even reached Truman, so
Really? Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely some parallels then from then and today because it's the same thing over and over again.
well, I think the other thing that's really horrendous is that nuclear proliferation and renewed building of more nuclear weapons and talking seriously about ever using one is all suddenly accelerating, and that scares the heck out of me.
Me too. Me too. We got to leave a good world for our children. So we need to back off of that. But getting to happier times, what do you hope readers walk away feeling after finishing the book?
I think that life is complicated and marriage is complicated, and, I do kinda give them a bit of a happily ever after, or maybe it's the happily ever after for now at the end of the book, that they kind of reconcile and are looking towards a brighter future. But, also it's really kind of a coming of age story because Doris, like my mother, was only 19 when she gets married, and then she gets pregnant immediately and goes to Oak Ridge with a toddler and has to figure out how to be a mother, how to be a wife, how to deal with the fact that she's missed out on the end of her college that she was expecting to have. So all those kind of disappointments and and then it follows along for a few years after the war. So, trying to figure out how to have a happy family life. I think that's one of the things that's a theme in the book.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So you've had such an accomplished career from psychology to entrepreneurship to writing. What has surprised you most about this chapter of your life?
I think one of the things that surprised me the most is how much I enjoy my networking with other women writers, and a lot of them are around my age. We're all the old ladies of the writing group, and I've become really involved with the Women's Fiction Writers Association has a historical fiction group, and we meet online every week. And I live in Houston, and I don't have that many close friends locally, but it's really nice to interact with friends online and, share marketing tips and, talk about our books. And I'm one of the volunteers now who helps coordinate those meetings. So, and also I have a Substack. So I've met other people on Substack. So, that was a surprise. I didn't really expect that social benefit from writing because I think of writing as a kind of solitary thing.
Sure, absolutely. And those groups can help immensely. Really, you're not like an island anymore, you're like a community. I noticed that too. I was reluctant to join them to start off with, but I'm so glad I did. I've learned a lot, we've become friends and it's nice cuz where I live, there's not a lot of people around here either. So, that is a nice community. That's a good thing.
And I met two other writers when I went to a workshop in Provence, in 2023, and we've been meeting online ever since and critiquing each other's work, so we have a mini critique group, and last November, we all went to the Kauai Writers Conference together and had a real blast, so that was a lot of fun.
That's great, and it's nice to have other writers that you can, like, turn to, especially before the editor, because once the editor gets it, it's but it's nice to have some friends first that would, take a look. So, if you could go back and give one piece of advice to someone living in Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project, knowing what we know now, what would you tell them?
Boy, well, there's a lot of ongoing nuclear pollution in Oak Ridge, but I'm not sure how to tell somebody to try to avoid that. Even my dad got a overdose of radiation accidentally when some of his buddies who were working on a hot sample on the other side of a wall forgot to shield it with lead bricks on the wall where my dad's desk was, and luckily he was okay and he never got cancer and lived to be 87, but, you know, they're even still now cleaning up parts of Oak Ridge, and there was also, tremendous amount of secrecy in Oak Ridge, and my parents were both told about the bomb right at the beginning, which was really unusual for such a junior person, and my mom was included, so it must have been really hard for them to keep that secret when everybody around them, a lot of people didn't know. My dad's work group knew, but, none of the other wives probably, very few of them knew what was going on. Everybody had no idea what they were working on there, so
Oh, I bet that was intense and scary. So, where can the listeners find you?
well, I have an author website, it's just Leslie Schover Author, and I have a Substack called Nuclear Fiction Newsletter where I write about behind the book stories, and recently I've also done a whole series on writing sex scenes. I thought I'd transfer some of my expertise from being a psychologist into, writing craft issues, and so I gave a talk to the group I'm involved with and did a series of Substack posts on why it's so hard to write sex scenes and embarrassing and how to try to do it better and make it part of your story.
That's really interesting, and that's true, you don't realize it. I've only written a couple, and each time I'm like, "Oh, this is weird." But, readers want it, so
Well, and I think it can be a legitimate part of your story, a way to reveal more things about your characters and the plot, so
absolutely, absolutely. Well, Leslie, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
thank you.
What stayed with me after this conversation was the idea that history isn't just dates and headlines, it's marriages, secrets, fears, ambition, and ordinary people trying to navigate extraordinary moments. Leslie's story reminds us that fiction can sometimes bring us closer to the emotional truth of history rather than facts alone. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out Fission, a novel of atomic heartbreak, and follow Leslie's work online. And as always, thank you for listening to Plot Twist Radio.